Pnawn da besides Ceri. So a little bit about myself first before we get started. So I was a software developer for 18 years within the sort of DRM and security solutions space. And I joined the InfoSec game back in August 2019. Been dedicated to red teaming and offensive security tooling for the last two and a half years, and have released some tools to the community, namely tools like Botnet, Sweet Potato, and SharpBlock. And more recently, I have become a member of the Rubius maintainer team. So what will we cover today in our talk? What is process injection and why do we leverage it as offensive security operators? So what methods are currently used typically today? How is process injection detected? I'll give a quick primer on function hooking. Now, you might be wondering why function hooking is in a process injection talk, but hopefully once we get onto the technique, it'll make a little more sense. Then we'll go on to the process injection technique itself, and obviously, demo gods allowing, I'll do a live demo and hopefully it'll all go well. Detection results. I had a maybe pool of 6 or 7 EDRs that I was able to test against, and then perhaps some improvements that could be made to the POC that I'll release after the talk, where perhaps it'll be improved even further, and if we've got time, a quick Q&A. So what is process injection? So process injection is the action of injecting, well, it doesn't necessarily mean malicious, but generally malicious code into a foreign process. And as offensive security operators, why do we want to do this? So what I call the 3 Bs, the first one being breaking execution chains. So what I mean by that is an execution chain is typically the child-parent relationship between processes and how they execute. So, DFIR teams or blue teams will often use that execution chain within EDR portals to track sort of what a particular process has been doing. So if you can inject into a foreign process in a way that is not detected, it generally means you're breaking that execution chain, making it more difficult to see what malicious activity that particular process was doing. Another one of the Bs is blending malicious activity. So let's say, for example, your C2 is communicating over HTTP, then it's a good idea to inject your shellcode on your C2 agent into browser processes, so Edge or Chrome. So that means then the EDR is tracking domains and URLs that are from a browser process, so that it tends to blend in better than, let's say, some random executable you've just downloaded from the web and is all of a sudden making calls out to some random domains. And then the final reason is bypass security controls. So a good example here potentially would be port 88 and Kerberos traffic. On a Windows platform, that typically is done from the LSAS process and can now and again originate from browsers as well. So EDR and SIEMs will have rules that will look for suspicious Kerberos traffic based on the originating process. So if you were to use Rubius, for example, from a non-browser process or from LSAS, then that is typically raised as an alert. So it's a good idea to inject yourself into maybe a browser process and then run Rubius from memory to bypass that type of control. So how is it done? Typically broken into 3 steps. So you have the executable memory allocation or the allocation primitive. So this is the piece where you basically, from a malicious process, you allocate memory in the foreign process so that you can write your malicious code. Then we move on to the second primitive, and that's the writing of the actual code. And then the all-important third primitive is the execution of the code itself. So what techniques exist for the various primitives that we need to perform? So on the allocation side, there are API calls like virtualalloc EX. This is what we would say your vanilla way of allocating memory within a foreign process. And it's quite often used by a lot of injection tools. NT-map through a section is another API call. This is typically used when mapping DLLs or EXEs in memory. You can also have them be anonymous, but it's just another way of sort of allocating memory within that foreign process. And so code caves then is not an allocation primitive as such, because a code cave, by its very nature, already exists within that foreign process. A good example of a code cave is the bytes in between various functions. A function might align on a 16-byte boundary, for example. So you may have, a space for injecting code in there. The disadvantage of code caves, of course, is the space is very small. So injecting your 300K beacon into it is just not going to work. Then we move on to write primitives. The vanilla API used in this process is write process memory. API calls like NT-map view of section, there's no cross-process as such, so you can basically use the NT-map view of section API to get a block of memory within your injector process, and then any action you do within that get automatically mirrored within the destination process or the target process. Atom bombing, so that's a technique using Windows Global Atoms. And then ghostwriting is a technique where you're manipulating threads to read from your injector process as opposed to writing into it. But sort of all these techniques do involve with various interactions across your injector process to your target process. And then we have the all-important execution primitive, which is the piece that actually executes the shellcode that you've wrote into that foreign process. Vanilla API in this case, create remote thread. Almost every example out there in the web, you will see those three in order, and you tend to see create remote thread as that last execution primitive. NTQAPC thread is a method of hijacking, if you will, an already existing thread. But they have to be in a particular state for you to do that. They have to be in an alertable state. So they have to be waiting on something. So you can't always use it if you can't find a thread that's in that particular state. Thread manipulation. So that's where you target an already existing thread in a remote process. You suspend it, set the thread context, which usually involves setting the instruction pointer to that of the memory that you've injected, and then resuming that thread once again, which will then trigger the execution. ROP chains via stack bombing. So using the same trio of APIs above as thread manipulation, you're using them APIs, but instead of setting the instruction pointer, you are manipulating the stack and writing to the stack, which will then potentially trigger ROP chains. But all of these actions basically are involving an interaction from the injector process to the target process. I haven't gone into massive detail. I've just given you a brief sort of overview of the various primitives. And that's because Safe Breach's talk from 2019, process injection techniques, got to catch them all. Well worth having a look at. They go into great detail of all the various execution, allocation and writing primitives for process injection. So detection, how do EDRs commonly detect these things? It's quite often they will look at the three. They'll look at the three primitives in sort of succession. So you have your allocation, your write, and your execute primitive. So when it sees them, especially when they group together in a short space of time, it's a good indication, that you're injecting into a foreign process. Now, the challenge that EDR vendors have is you also have legitimate activity that does this, especially allocation and writing primitives, because a lot of processes will use that for even inter-process communication. So it doesn't necessarily mean the action is malicious, but the all-important execution primitive, on the other hand, that does trigger the actual execution. So what happens if we sort of remove that last cross-process execution primitive? What results do we get in terms of detection? So before we get onto that, I'll give you a quick primer on function hooking and what exactly that is. So function hooking is the art, if you will, of redirecting the behavior of a function. So on the left there, you'll see an example of an unhooked function. And you have, say, notepad.exe that makes an API call to create event W, which lives inside kernel base. .dll or sometimes kernel 32, depending on what operating system. And then the execution flow will follow through the create event W and then return back to Notepad once it's done. Now, when it comes to hooking, the first instruction is modified, so it's patched within that create event function, and the jump instruction is typically used, and that will jump to another piece of code. Now, that piece of code then can perhaps modify the arguments to create event W in a way that's to the attacker's advantage, or perhaps it won't even make a call to the original function at all. A good example of this is an AMSI bypass technique, where instead of it calling the original function, it just returns true to say that the payload is clean. So onto the actual technique itself. So on the right-hand side there, that's sort of your typical memory layout of a process that's allocated within Windows. So at the top, you have the memory that is used for the heap, the stack, that kind of thing. And then your various DLLs are spread along towards the bottom of the memory space. Now, in between each DLL, when Windows allocates a DLL, it will leave a gap. Now, it's not a memory hole in the sense of a code cave, so you can't use these memory holes for actually injecting instantly, because it's unallocated memory. But they do leave gaps between one DLL to the next. And that sort of becomes quite important with the actual technique. And the reason being is we want to put a hook plus the shellcode that we want to execute just above or just below the address space of the DLL that we're looking to inject into. And the reason being is we end up putting a call instruction inside a particular export. I gave an example of create event W just now, but it can be any export. And the reason being is a relative function call uses up about 5 bytes of memory, and because it's relative, you can only jump or call within plus or minus 2 gig from where you're actually making the call from. So that's why it's sort of important to find unallocated memory either above 2 gig or below 2 gig of where your patch is going to be. And then this is the all-important factor. Once you've put your hook in place, which then is followed by the shellcode, and then you've patched the exported function, you're now waiting for legitimate process activity to call your API. So there's no third execution primitive, if you will. You're actually just relying on the behavior of the program to execute your shellcode. So when that actually happens, the injector is not actually doing any form of action cross-process. You're just waiting for that particular API to be called. So what does the hook code look like? Stage 1, you can see right at the very top there in the top right, it's hijacking the actual execution flow itself. Now, typical hooks will use a jump instruction for that first patch that you do, but for this particular technique, we want to use a call instruction instead. And the reason being is you pop on a function call, the return address is pushed onto the stack. Now we pop that off immediately as the first instruction, and within our RAX register, we'll get the return address of where the call function was just made from. And that all-important 5 bytes patch is then subtracted from that. So then by the time you subtract the 5 bytes, we've actually calculated the address that we originally hooked. Then you're moving on to saving the original volatile registers. So on x64 architecture, RCX, RDX, R8, R9, they are used for the arguments, for passing arguments into particular functions. So if we don't save these, so these would be whatever Notepad was, using to call create event W, for example. If we don't save these for later, it means you're likely to crash the behavior. You're likely to crash the process that you're targeting. Next stage, restoration. So where you see that hex value there, which is not particularly clear because bad choice of red, but there's 1, 1, 2, 2, 3, 3, 4, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 8. That is generated dynamically. So that's the only part of the shellcode that's sort of dynamic depending on which export you're actually targeting. And that's just the 8 bytes that existed where that patch was. Even though the patch is only 5 bytes, because it's, we can do that copy in one operation because it's a 64-bit value. We actually take whatever 8 bytes was there prior to patching create event W, for example. And what the restoration is doing is essentially putting that back. So by the time you get to this red area here, create event W is no longer hooked. So any other future calls to create event W at that point will continue to execute as normal. And then it's the all-important setup for actually calling the shellcode that you're injecting. So the shellcode itself immediately follows this assembly blob, if you will. So it's a relative function call, but you're talking maybe 10 bytes after this particular hook code to call your calc payload or your C2 beacon, whatever it may be. And then once that call function returns, your shellcode is executed and done its merry thing. So then we're now starting the reverse of what we've done at the start. So we're restoring all the non-volatile registers. So this puts it back in a state where you've got the original arguments. These were the arguments that was originally used to call the create event W function when Notepad made that call. And then finally, you're restoring the calculated hook address so that then you can jump back to that exported function. So it means the original intended behavior of that program will still continue as expected. You don't want your program to crash once your shellcode is executed. So these last few stages are there to restore that behavior and make sure that create event W API call succeeds as it would have even if you hadn't patched it. Okay, so which DLL exports do you target to patch? The main ones should be NTDLL, kernel base, kernel 32. The main reason being is they are the address that they exist in every process on Windows is the same. Now they do change from one OS boot to another, but on a single boot of Windows, kernel 32, NTDLL, kernel base, they'll all be in the same base address within every process. So it means you can calculate the address, let's say create event W, which is the example I've been given. Whatever address that is at in your injector process, it'll be at the same address in your target process, but that won't be true of all DLLs. Then you can use tools such as API Monitor to target a particular process that you want to, you want to sort of target within your actual environment. You typically do this away from your environment, so within your VM, you'd sort of start up Chrome and the API Monitor and just have a look what APIs it's sort of calling and ones that might work out as good targets. But definitely avoid really busy API calls. So heap allocations, anything to do with closing handles, anything to do with synchronization, like RTL and the critical section, they're all really busy API calls. If I actually go back here, up until the point where you get to the restore phase, you've essentially got you've got yourself a race condition there. So if you've got, say, 4 or 5 threads making a call to create event W all at the same time, then there's a good chance that your shellcode will actually execute multiple times. Now, you do that with one of the really busy API calls, you're going to end up with 1,000 beacons checking in, which you don't really want. So yeah, so target sort of APIs that are, not called that often, but called enough that you are going to get execution. Now, the other advantage to this particular technique is you can target specific APIs, so you're essentially then time bombing your shellcode execution. So you could, I got terminate process there, but really the exit process would be a better target. So you could inject Explorer, for example, and target the exit process API. So then you could trigger your shellcode to execute when the operating system is shutting down, for example. Or the WinSock APIs, the connect function, that's used when making a TCP connection. So potentially you might want your shellcode to execute when that connect API is made. So it's a good way of actually time bombing the execution as well. Okay, the all-important demo time. so the tool itself I'll release after this talk. It's only a POC tool, so essentially it takes the shellcode. If you want to inject specific shellcode, if you don't provide one, it will pop a calc-based shellcode, specify the PID that you want to inject into the DLL, and then the export you want to target. So I've set up Notepad and Chrome as examples here. I've already stored the PIDs for these just so that I can make the demo quicker. So here you can say I've chosen kernel-based.dll and then create event W. Oh, good, it's got in. I'm actually doing this on my own one, and I need to do that. Yeah, I have to put it down because I can't do both at the same time. Oh, see, they never go well, do they?
There you go, dude.
Thank you. Right, here we go. Right, can we see it? Right, look over here. Right, so the POC itself, you basically got a few parameters to it. One is the shellcode. If you don't provide the shellcode parameter, it basically pops calc. And then the process ID that you want to target, the DLL that you want to target, and the export address. Where's my Chrome gone now? Oh God, no! There it is. Right. Okay. Right. Okay. So, like the example I gave in the actual slide, kernel-based.dll injecting into the create event W. Right. You press enter. That does its thing. Now I know when Chrome has focus, it calls that API. Right? Right. Notepad. Sure if that's the right notepad. Where I'll go now. Yeah, so with Notepad, I've chosen map viewer file EX. I hope that's the one. So I can sort of type in there. I know that API call doesn't really get called during that, but should get called when I try to save. Bring up the save dialog. Okay, on to results. Let me get the presentation back, and then I'll take that back up. Right, detection. So these are the ones that I've managed to sort of source various friends around the world to test against. As you can see, mostly across the board. No blocked, no detected. The ones where there is a hyphen in the block state just means it's not relevant for that particular EDR. Now, the only one that did detect activity was Silence Optics. Now that was set in an aggressive mode, and what it actually detected was the first two primitives. It actually detected the allocation and the write. Didn't necessarily detect the execution. If any of you are running Silence Optics in aggressive mode, I'd love to hear from you to see how effective that is actually in an enterprise environment, because I'd imagine you'd also get a lot of false positives with it just triggering on them first two write primitives. So possible improvements, how can that POC be improved a bit further? So the POC itself is using the most vanilla form of allocation and write primitives. So perhaps using sort of more covert allocation and write primitives might also prevent the EDRs that we're alerting to stop. Patchless hooking techniques is a similar technique that is used in SharpBlock, where you attach yourself as a debugger, and then instead of patching the export, maybe using hardware breakpoints instead, So that also will eliminate one of the cross-process writes. So that's another improvement that could potentially be made. Now, at the moment, the POC is using RWX, so it changes the memory on the export address itself. And that's because the hook code has to restore the original, bytes back to what they were. So the hook code could be made more complex so that it also changes the protection of the export on the fly. So you would end up making a call to change it to RWX, patch it, and then change it back. So then a possible improvement there. Support more DLLs. The POC itself, like I said, will only sort of target DLLs that are traditionally already loaded in all processes. So kernel 32, kernel base NTDLL, and it calculates the address based on that. But using that technique for all DLLs is not going to work because they potentially are different base addresses. So there's an improvement that could potentially be made there where it remotely enumerates the loaded modules in your target process. And then last but not least, the technique in the POC, it executes on the thread that actually triggers the execution. So if you're injecting, let's say, a C2 beacon that internally doesn't create the thread, it means your shellcode will never return until your beacon is exited, and that's likely to lock up say Notepad, which is the example we used, right? So modifying that hook code so that it creates a thread internally within the process. So not across from the injector process, using the actual hook code to create the thread for your shellcode to execute on. So by implementing that, then it means it's easier to sort of get your C2 executing alongside original program behavior. And that's it. Any questions? Well, it's all to do with permissions, right? So if it's an initial access payload and you're a low privilege user, you're only going to be able to execute really into, same process of that user. But, if you've already privilege escalate in your system, unless they're protected processes, you should be able to process anything. Inject anything, sorry. Anything else? Nope. Great. Thanks for listening.